Welcome, my friends, to Scotch and a Beer with Officer Dan, episode 18. This one's going to be a little bit different because I'm kind of veering off the tracks of my story, which I will get back into next week. I just got back from Hawaii and I didn't write it. I have to kind of write everything down so I can keep my thoughts in order and not mess up the damn thing. So instead, what I'm going to do today is talk about scotches in general. I still have a scotch and a beer to drink whilst I'm explaining these things, but as of the 17th of this month, which is October, there's going to be a 25% tariff on all single malt scotches. Thanks, Trump. That's awesome. In light of that, I kind of wanted to explain what each region of Scotland produces so that you can go out and buy a couple before the tariffs take place. Because otherwise, it's just going to cost you 25% more for no freaking reason. But before I get into all of that, I'm going to go over the beer. This one's going to be a limited edition Trader Joe's Johnny, called the Howling Gourds Pumpkin Ale, bottled by Joseph Brow, or Joseph Brow, depending. It's almost Halloween. Fall is in the air. Not really, I'm wearing shorts and a t-shirt, but hey, it's coming up quick. So let's give this a try. It's the first time I've ever had this. I don't think I've ever seen it there before. It is 7% alcohol by volume. And just like any basic bitch, I do enjoy some pumpkin in my life from time to time. This is a damn good ale. And a very, very strong pumpkin-y flavor with an 8% alcohol by volume that'll get you messed up real quick. All right, I can dig that. I also got this glass a while back. It's got this silicone thing that goes inside there and actually freezes ice to one side of the glass, so that way the scotch stays cold but the ice doesn't melt as fast, so you get more flavor of the scotch whilst cooling it down. It's just one way to drink scotch that I'll go over here in just a little bit. The Glen 12-year double oak. I've never had this. I've had the Glenlivet 12-year, I've had the Nadura 12-year, I've had pretty much all of the other Glenlivets that they have except for like the 24, and wanted to give this one a try because it was on sale. Vibrantly golden color, this whiskey entices you, and a silky vanilla sweetness dances across your palate, followed by a rich fruit and subtle marzipan spice intensifying your flavor experience. The nose is vibrant aromas of summer meadows and tropical fruits, notably pineapple. On the palate is floral notes, smooth and sweet fruit notes of fresh peaches, pears, and vanilla, and the finish is marzipan and fresh hazelnuts. I like every single ingredient that they just mentioned in here, so this should be a very good tasting scotch to me. So let's give it the old college try. Plus that does look cool. Definitely gonna admit that. Really taste the vanilla, really taste the pear. The marzipan is super, super sugary, so I can also taste that as well now that it has finished, and it's really good. Wow. So this is one of the more inexpensive Glenlivets, and I actually really, really enjoy it. Kudos to them for making such a sweet, sweet scotch. So I guess we should start off with how to actually drink scotch. You've gone out to the store, you've bought a bottle of X scotch, and you've brought it home and you're ready to taste it. So how do you go about doing it for the first time? Technically, there's no one way to drink scotch. It's freestyle. It's like telling somebody how to drink their scotch is like telling somebody how they should have their hair cut or what shoe color they should wear. It's bullshit. Don't tell somebody how to drink their scotch. It's how they want to do it. As long as they're enjoying it, let them enjoy it. That being said, there are different ways to drink scotch. To make the most out of your single malt right off the bat, you do want to try it neat. This gives you all of the flavors that the distillers intended you to have, unless they specifically tell you to cut it with a few drops of water and or add ice. Then of course you would want to do that, and it varies per scotch. I, in particular, like to have my scotch just a little bit chilled. You never put a bottle of scotch in the freezer or the refrigerator, however. You always want to keep your scotch at room temperature. Now I prefer to drink my scotches out of a glass like this. This is what you will see at most bars. But the way to drink scotch properly is to be in a tulip-shaped wine-style glass. And this way you get a good swirl out of it, and it makes the aromas kind of congregate at the tip. So when you give it your sniff, you get the full smell that the distiller intended you to have. So there is technically a correct way to drink scotch, but I just enjoy it in a normal whiskey glass. Now the next step that you want to do once your dram is poured is to kind of hold it up to some light and check it out. Checking the color against the light will kind of give you a history of how it was distilled. It doesn't tell you how old it is or anything like that. A more golden colored scotch is going to come from sherry casks, while a more paler whiskey, such as this one, is going to come from a bourbon cask. Now another thing you can do to determine the approximate age and or quality of a scotch is to check its legs. And no, you're not lifting a skirt up. You're going to kind of let it rotate around the glass, and I've kind of done this in some of my other videos where I let it kind of get onto the side of the glass, and you can see the residue that forms where the scotch was. The slower the scotch moves back down to meet the rest of it, the older or more mature the scotch is going to be. So, because this one goes down so quickly, you would say this is a younger scotch that was done in bourbon casks. Now that you've determined the approximate age and makeup of the scotch just by looking at it, you're going to do what's called nosing. Now nosing is kind of an important step. You feel like, oh, I've looked at it a bunch and I've done this thing and I just want to drink the damn alcohol, but nosing is very important. You basically would hold the glass away from you, and as you're taking a deep breath, you would slide the glass underneath your nose, and on a first pass, you want to make a mental note of what that smell reminds you of. It's going to remind you of something. Most scotches are pretty pungent, so it's going to remind you of something. For instance, this one for some reason reminds me of being in South Carolina. I don't know why, but the first thought that came into my head as I smelled it was the aroma that I picked up when I was in South Carolina. And a lot of scotch has to do with rekindling memories of smells that you've had in the past. You can repeat this process a few times and you'll pick up different things as you smell it each time. Being outside with a little bit of a cross breeze isn't helping my situation, but I'm just showing you anyway. It might be really weird to smell it and you feel like a wine snob, but drinking scotch is kind of a multi-sensory activity. You want to get your whole body involved with what the scotch is doing to enjoy it the most. And finally, we get to the tasting portion. We've done all of this other stuff. It's finally time to taste it. Get that rewarding, delicious whiskey flavor. You want to put your tongue into a small spoon shape, and you want to take a very, very small sip of scotch. You don't sip scotch and then swallow it right away. That kind of ruins the whole experience. So you make the little spoon shape, you put a little bit of scotch on it, and you let it sit. As it's sitting, you think about what the flavors that are coming across your mind are. Do you taste vanilla? Do you taste toffee? Do you taste marzipan? Do you taste the sugar? Do you taste the plum? Do you taste the pear? What do you taste while it's sitting there on your tongue? There's no wrong answer as to how a scotch should taste for you, and it's going to taste different for everybody. Now, for people that aren't used to drinking hard alcohols, this can be a difficult process. Very counterintuitive to hold whiskey in your mouth. You're supposed to drink it because it's disgusting, whereas with scotch, it's delicious, so you want to hold it and actually savor the flavors that you're getting. And every step of that process that I just did is a different part of the scotch experience. This is a very crucial step because this allows you to A, remember what scotches you drank, so you can be the cool guy at the bar and be like, hey, I tasted that, that's a Glen Livet, or hey, I tasted that, that's Macallan, or whatever it might be. That takes a little bit of time, and you actually have to go through quite a bit of scotches to actually pick one out from a list. Now next I'm going to go over the way you prefer to drink your scotch. Like I said, I like mine with ice. There are some scotches that I like neat. The more smoky Islay scotches I like to have with just a few drops of water in them, but most of the Highland scotches I like on the rocks or on a rock. More particular, one big rock so it doesn't melt as fast. Now, if you are a Scotch snob and or aficionado, you will never put tap water into your Scotch. You will always use purified or distilled water. And if you were a real Scotch connoisseur, you would use water from Scotland. That's not on the table for everybody, and it's never on the table for me, so I use distilled water or water that has been filtered. And I do think that you should always try your whiskey neat first, so you get the full experience, and then you can change it or modify it to the way that you like to drink it afterwards. If you're trying a Scotch for the first time, by all means, try that sucker straight up. After your first sip, then you can add a few drops of water. You never want to add more than 20% water to Scotch. Otherwise, it's too diluted and you miss the whole point of having it. Then it's just a water that's whiskey flavored. At home, you can control this. At a bar, whiskey on the rocks is typically a no-no because it's always going to be tap water. And tap water has chlorine in it. The chlorine will ruin the flavor of a Scotch faster than you can shake a stick. If you do have to order Scotch on the rocks, ask for the Scotch straight up, then get a glass of ice on the side. This way you can regulate how much ice goes into your drink, because that ice will melt fast and you don't want to go over that 20% I just talked about. And finally, a gigantic no-no in the Scotch world is going to be mixers of any kind. You do not mix Scotches. Scotches were never meant to be poured into Coke or seltzer water or anything else other than pure distilled water. If you're gonna mix something, put Jack in it, put a cheap alcohol in it. Do not put a single malt Scotch into your mixed drink. Come on, people, work with me here. And if you do get a mixed drink with some Scotch in it, make sure it's a blended Scotch. Blended Scotches are a completely different thing than a single malt, and I'll go over that in just a second, because there are different types of Scotch whiskey. Now here's the basics about Scotch whiskey. To be considered a Scotch whiskey, it has to be two things. It has to be from Scotland, and it has to be at least 3 years old. All Scotch whiskey begins its life as malted barley. That's it. And there's a lot more to this, but you can basically break single malt Scotch down into a single malt, a pure single malt, and a blended whiskey. And there's different variations of each of those, but I don't feel like I need to go into that because it's just nitpicking. A single malt Scotch means it was made from water and malted barley from a single location. Never changed distilleries. It was made in one damn place. And that's what a single malt is, and that's really the simplest term for it. There's single grain as well, which has some additions to being a single malt, but I don't want to go into that because it's complicated. Now, a blended Scotch is going to be one that was made from one or more distilleries coming from either different batches of Scotches or different distilleries of Scotches. And there are different types of those too. There's blended and there's blended malt, but again, I don't want to go into the semantics of that. That's just not what I want to talk about right now. The interesting part about Scotches is kind of the way that they're made is determined by the region of Scotland that they come from. Scotland was traditionally divided into 4 regions: the Highlands, the Lowlands, the Isle of Islay, and Campbelltown. And technically 5, because due to the large amount of distilleries there, Speyside is also considered a region of Scotland where Scotch can come from. Any of the small islands that surround Scotland that have a distillery on them are kind of lumped into the Highland Scotch. Even though they may be a smoky style Islay, they're still lumped in as that generality. The Lowlands are going to be the southernmost region of Scotland. Speyside gets its name from the Spey River, which cuts its way through that region. The Highlands is both the largest region in Scotland as well as the largest amount of distilleries in Scotland. Campbelltown used to have around 30 distilleries, and it's now been whittled down to only 3. And then there's my favorite, Islay, which only has 9 producing distilleries at this very moment. Now again, these whiskeys are spelled without an E at the end of it, so it's Whisky. You cannot spell it whiskey if it's not from Scotland. Technically, it's like the Champagne, France. You cannot call it a champagne if it's not from Champagne, France. It's the same style thing with scotches. And they're very, very particular about it. There's an entire organization called the Scottish Whisky Association, which regulates all of this stuff and makes sure that nobody's calling a scotch when it shouldn't be a goddamn scotch. Since I'm going over that, I'd like to read you the rules of Scotch. The document which defines Scotch whisky in the following manner. It must be produced at a distillery in Scotland from water and malted barley, to which only the whole grains of other cereals may be added, all of which have been processed at that distillery into a mash, converted at that distillery into a fermentable substrate only by endogenous enzyme systems, fermented at that distillery by only adding yeast, and distilled at an alcoholic strength by volume of less than 94.8 or 190 US proof, wholly matured in an excise warehouse in Scotland in oak casks of a capacity not exceeding 700 liters, aka 185 gallons, for at least 3 years. The Scotch whisky must retain the color, aroma, and taste of the raw materials used in and the method of its production and maturation. It may not contain any added substances aside from water and plain E150A caramel coloring. It must comprise a minimum alcoholic strength by volume of 40%, aka 80 proof. That's the rules for an actual Scotch whisky. Now I'm going to go over the specifics of each region that I just talked about. Let's start with the Highlands. The Highlands are known as medium-bodied whiskeys. Now they're typically lighter and more luxurious than their Islay cousins, but they're stronger than the ones in the lowlands. Now the lowlands are considered the most delicate of the Scotch whiskies. These distilleries use little to no peat, so there's almost no smokiness in a lowland Scotch. So if you want to stay away from smoky, you would want to get a lowland, then move on to Highland, and then wherever else you want to go from there. Speyside are considered the most elegant. They're the fruitiest style of Scotches in Scotland. This is now the home to the most distilleries in Scotland as well. So you have a lot of choices when it comes to a Speyside. Campbelltown, like I said, you're only going to have 3 active distilleries, so you're very limited on choices, and you're going to be at least at a 10-year for most of these. I don't think that they offer anything less than a 10-year Scotch. I myself have personally never even had a Campbelltown Scotch, so I'm going to have to get one of those for the next episode. Islay, my favorite. This is the cigar butts. This is the smoke. This is the ashtray. This is the most hardcore form of Scotch that you could possibly have in your life. These are considered the heavy hitters of the Scotch world. This is not what you want to try if you're trying to get into Scotch. This is going to be something that's going to turn you off of Scotches. It's going to make you puke. It's going to make you feel uneasy. As you get into Scotches more, it becomes a way to escape from the other Scotches, and I find it to be a beautiful place to be. There are only 8 distilleries in the Islay region right now, which does mean you have a lot of choices, but not as many choices as some of the other places in Scotland. I lost my battery at an unknown time while I was explaining this. I think it left off where I was talking about the different regions of Scotland. Now I'd like to go over a few Scotch terms with you guys so you look like a pro when you're at the bar, either listening to conversations or ordering your own goddamn Scotch. The Angel's Share. The Angel's Share is what actually evaporates from the casks. It doesn't get soaked into the wood, it's just gone. The angels have taken it, and you're left with the rest of the whiskey. This is usually around 2% per year. The Devil's Share. The Devil's Share is what has actually soaked into the wood of the barrels that you're aging the whiskey in. So the devil takes his cut, the angels get their cut, and we get the rest, which is the Lion's Share. There's the Dram. There's a dram of scotch. People pour a dram, but nobody actually knows what a dram is. It's just a fancy way to say that I'm drinking scotch and you're not. Peat. Man, that's a peaty scotch. The peat is the dead stuff, basically that's what it is, that they use to dry the malts used to make the actual mash, which goes into the scotch. Now, the malt soaks in all the flavors of the dead stuff, so that smoke gets transferred into the malt gets transferred into the whiskey. When they actually distill everything, you get a peaty scotch, which just means it's smoky as all get up. There's cask strength Scotch whiskey, which just means that it's still at the strength that came out of the cask. It's not diluted with water. You can cut it with your own water, and that makes it more money for your dollar. Cask strength. There's chill filtered whiskey and there's non-chill filtered whiskey. It just means it's going to be a whiskey that's either cloudy or it's not cloudy. Same as beer. The cooperage is the area in which they age and mature the scotch. It's the barrel. It's a cask made of American oak, Spanish oak, brandy cask, sherry cask, American bourbon cask. There's many different ways for a distiller to age their alcohol, and that cooperage is what gives all of the whiskey its flavor. The cooper is the person who is in charge of the cooperage. There's malts and malting. The malts are the barley grains that have been put through the malting process. And the malting process is where the starch of the barley is turned into sugar, which is then turned into alcohol. This is then added to warm water and sugars, and that has become your mash. When you ask for a whiskey at the bar, you're going to say, do I want it on the rocks? Do I want it neat? Do I want it straight up? Straight up and neat are basically the same thing. On the rocks is of course with ice. You can also ask for it with a few drops of water. There's a lot more to drinking scotch and owning scotch and or saving scotch as a way to make money and or saving scotch to drink. I usually have a bottle of scotch for over a year. When I get a certain feeling or I feel a certain way, I want a very specific flavor of scotch to go along with those feelings. And that is why scotch is kind of so special to me. When I'm in a very certain mood, I drink a scotch. Otherwise, I'm drinking a new scotch for Scotch and a Beer like I'm doing right now. I want you guys to go out and find your own scotches. I want you to find what makes you happy, and I want you to post it up in the comments. I want to read about it. I want to hear about it. I want to hear if you hated it. I want to hear if you loved it. I want to hear if you went back to drinking wine for some reason. I want to know about all of that stuff in the comments. So if this video helped you get into scotch, if it helped you appreciate scotch but still not drink scotch, let me know. I want to know about all these things. I hope this has helped in any way, shape, or form. This is Officer Dan signing off on another Scotch and a Beer. I'll get back into the story next time where I become Danny George's spotter and go through my 2013 season not knowing what the hell to do before Formula Drift. I'll catch you guys on the flip side. Officer Dan out.